familiar face from Seattle Fire. No longer with Seattle Fire, now chief up in Orcas. I've been with City of Seattle for 11 years. I've been in the emergency management profession for almost 20 years. As I was sharing, I started my career in emergency management at City of Kirkland, where I was doing public education outreach, so really doing that community engagement. From there, I got an opportunity to join King County Emergency Management, and one of the speakers that you have is my former boss, Eric Holdeman. He's going to come in and speak to you. When I was at King County, I got an opportunity to actually get into a number of areas. I was able to get into training and exercises. I also did operations there, and then I moved to City of Bellevue and was their emergency manager for a short time, which I really got to do kind of the whole umbrella. So I've been very lucky to have the whole span of emergency management opportunities. So, you know, from the grassroots of getting out into the community and talking with the community and informing them on what they need to do to be personally prepared, to getting into how do you run an emergency operations center, what are all the nooks and crannies that you have to get in place and be ready to go when something bad happens. So I definitely want this to be interactive, so if you've got questions, feel free to offer them up. I know all of you have in some way or form some experiences that I'm sure you can lend to the conversation. So this isn't just Laurel up here talking to you. I definitely want you to engage in some questions and answering, and hopefully I can answer your questions for you. Before we kick off, are there certain expectations that you have of this presentation today? Anything that when you were thinking, you were looking at the topic and thinking, well, this is what I'd like to hear, or this is what I think are some of the challenges. Is there any thoughts that you have that you might want to be interested in?
Kind of interested in your perspectives.
My perspective? Involvement. Great. I will definitely impart that.
Cascadia and maybe those some good things.
Great. Good.
I'm curious about the city's processes and how the city expects to partner with other agencies, the county, the Guard,
Yep.
the federal agencies like FEMA, Task Force.
Great. Good. Good to hear. Any other thoughts or ideas? Okay. Let's dive in here. So I pulled off the internet. There's a whole smattering of disasters and hazards that we have across the nation. And clearly in the last year we've seen so many large incidents happen that really, I think, are the crux of what we face when we get into emergency management and trying to lead a response to a disaster, is that there are going to be novel situations and there is just going to be a plethora of information that we've got to deal with. So we're up in Region 10, and obviously most of what we deal with are weather-related incidents, but as you all have seen in the past couple of years, we've had the bad wildland fires on the east side of the state. We can easily have those on this side. I live on a piece of property, 3.5 acres, and most of it's wooded, and I get scared when we start getting into that dry season and thinking about what that could happen. And I'm in a urban wildland interface environment, so it could just take off like a matchstick. So there's lots of things that can happen, not only in our region here, but across the nation. Let me ask you, what's one particular disaster, be it in the last 5 years or the last 10 years, that's really seared a memory on your brain? What might have been one of those disasters? Yes?
I grew up in Wenatchee, and every summer there's really bad forest fires that happen. And I used to work at the library, and we'd like pass out gas masks to everyone and stuff.
The smoke.
Couldn't see like 10 feet in front of you.
Yeah, they've been pretty bad the last few years. Other ones?
The East Japan catastrophe of 2011. That was, I saw live footage. It was incredible to witness that.
Yeah, who would have thought that we would have had an earthquake and then we would have had a nuclear radiological spill and the tsunami of all the countries that are probably the most prepared for earthquake. Any other examples to share?
For me, it was OSO. I was part of the response to OSO. And,
Yeah.
We, in Region 10's Homeland Response Force, practice for all that,
Yeah.
except mudslides.
Yeah.
And that was the one that was our first bona fide deployment to.
Yeah.
And we didn't have the equipment. It was a very dynamic environment, so I won't forget I guess.
Yeah, it's stuck in your memory, yeah. Let's walk through a couple of those. So as Hans mentioned, we had the Japan earthquake back in March of 2011. And again, Japan is probably the most prepared country in the world for earthquakes. And they just also faced inundation of the earthquake. And so we saw a very large tsunami that impacted the whole coastal line, let alone the nuclear plants that were also impacted, and all the subsequent factors that we had to deal with on this side of the Pacific Ocean, and that there was a raised fear of any of that radiological cloud coming this way. We were fielding a lot of calls from the mayor's office, from community members that really had sincere concerns about what there could be or not be for exposure. We saw myoptically those small images, and when you start pulling out, you realize the magnitude. This was not just a typical routine kind of disaster. This was truly a catastrophic crisis situation. And we saw a large loss of life. The mention about Oso landslide. I remember I was at Red Robin up in Sammamish and got a page across that there had been a landslide up in the Snohomish area. You may see the short images, but then you start seeing the actual larger picture of the impact. And again, you get these myopic views of what's going on, but when you start realizing you get helos and aviation assets out there and you start getting the larger picture of what's going on, you don't realize the magnitude. Again, we lost 44 individuals. 43 in that particular disaster. You'll have an opportunity to meet my colleague, Jason Bierman, who's going to be one of your presenters for one of the seminars here. We just recently saw this last fall down in California. Holy moly, you cannot have enough resources to respond to the magnitude of what they faced down there. I was down in California in Sacramento in January, and they were dealing with floods. And it was gorgeous because there was all kinds of vegetation. And then you realize that all that fuel, things just got dry and dry and dry before you knew it again. It was just a matchbox that was just ready to happen. From a small perspective, you started hearing about houses burning down, and then lo and behold, there were thousands of houses that got burnt down. And again, loss of life during that incident. And subsequently, as we've seen in the last few weeks, all the after effects of that scorched land, and now they've got rain, they're starting to deal with the landslides and the mudslides, and again, we're dealing with those crises. So things can oftentimes have a domino effect. They can have a domino effect on the short term, they can have a domino effect on the long term. We also saw this last fall. Barb Graff, who's our director, and I have the opportunity to participate. We are part of the Big City Emergency Managers Group, and we meet with our respective colleagues from the large metropolitan cities. So New York City, LA, Miami, Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, San Diego, Houston, Dallas, etc. And we get this opportunity to actually hear very heart to heart what happens in their responses and their recovery. Of course, who would have known that 50 inches of rain would just deluge down into the Houston area, into Harris County? Again, small perspective of we just see minimal flooding from that very myopic view, and then when you pull out, you realize the thousands and thousands and thousands of houses that are impacted and people that are displaced and all the consequences that you've got to deal with from an emergency management perspective. We rely on our colleagues like Jay and our colleagues in the fire who are dealing with the actual crisis on scene, but we're the ones that are going to be looking at everything else that's been impacted and all the consequences. So day to day, we've got great systems in place to deal with the ordinary, to deal with maybe minor incidents and major incidents. In the fire service, they have field operation guides, they have standard operating procedures that helps guide them as a team on what they need to do. I'm sure Jay has flipped through many of those through his career. Those are known incidents that we have procedures and plans in place. Oftentimes the leadership is experienced, they're trained, they know how to respond. Typically in a fire response, you've got a number of personnel that are going at the same time. They may be supplemented with police. You may have utilities. If it's something that's impacting water or roadways, or you may have electrical folks that are also responding to that. They're known incidents, so we walk in pretty much doing a quick assessment, and if you're an experienced person, you kind of pretty much quick look, you go through your protocols, and then you can kind of start responding and dealing with what's going on. And usually you can sweep up and get out of there in a short amount of time. There may be some incidents that are a little bit more intense that may cause you to be more reactive on scene, but you still probably have those plans and procedures in place that kind of help guide what you need to do. Unfortunately, there are going to be those large catastrophic crisis situations. The Cascadia Exercise is one of those. I rattled off a number of them that we just walked through on the slides. They are going to be novel situations. Scott Hines, who's the Deputy Director for Pierce County Emergency Management, was at our Disaster Management Committee meeting yesterday, just getting a high-level debrief on the Amtrak incident. Well, Amtrak, that bridge straddles on the Thurston County, Pierce County lines. It impacted WashDOT infrastructure. The rail is owned by the rail company, but it's managed by Sound Transit. You had Amtrak, who owned the train. You had WSP that had to respond. You had a number of just factors that were coming into play that made it a very stressful, very large incident that required a lot of coordination with one another. And Scott said, who would have ever thought that we would have, if we were to do an exercise that put an Amtrak passenger train down on I-5 with all these different agencies and organizations tied in on weeks before the holiday and people are trying to get back and forth. He goes, if we had put that into an exercise, people would have thought we were nuts. Well, those are the types of things that we have to think about. Is it's those things that, golly sakes, you would never imagine that it would plug into a disaster, that it has this domino effect. So subsequently, we've got to get ourselves into training and dealing with novel situations. How do we get this thing and get all of us collectively to be able to think innovatively, to improvise and deal with those novel situations? In those novel situations, there is no game plan. Joe Pfeiffer, who's one of the deputy chiefs for New York City when 9/11, when he was in Tower 1 and they evacuated out and they got into Tower 2 and they evacuated out, he goes, I had no plan. And that's hard when you are trained and you're used to those routine things. It's hard to admit. He goes, I just had to step back and take a breath. You know, we're always like, we gotta go, we gotta go, we gotta go, we gotta make decisions. In reality, he had to just step back and kind of reassess where he was at. So in addition to that, they're going to be complex. There's lots of factors involved. We cannot have enough resources. We do have to leverage our regional partners, our state partners, our federal partners, our military partners, our private sector partners, because we just can't have enough of those resources. People complain about City of Seattle not having enough snowplows. Well, we can't have enough snowplows because we don't deal with snow every year. We can force multiply and expand that by contracting with other providers, or we can leverage our parks department, our utilities department, outfit their trucks with snow blades in front. We can leverage that, but you just never can have enough resources, but you have to leverage your partners that may have those resources to bring in. They're of significant scale, and the term that's used is landscape scale, and I would call the Japan earthquake as one of those. The Indonesian tsunami back in 2004, I think, you know, widespread. So we have to be able to be nimble. We have to be able to diagnose. We have to be able to improvise. We have to be able to innovate. And you know what? Sometimes we're going to make mistakes. But by gosh, we've got to do something rather just than swallowing and trying to figure out what we need to do. We've got to be able to evolve in those situations. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick snapshot of our world in Seattle Office of Emergency Management. And I'll tell you from my personal experience, I have not been in a catastrophic disaster. We've yet to have that large earthquake here that's going to cause infrastructure damages. We have no water, we have no sewer, we have no communications. We have thousands of people that either have been injured or we have fatalities. I have not personally gone through that. But I'm going to share with you some of the experiences and some of the processes and systems that we have in place. So this gives you a flavor. We keep a running kind of tally of all the responses that we have had for our Emergency Operations Center. We activate our EOC about 6 to 8 times a year. Most of them are weather related, and by gosh, those are nice because we can pre-plan for them. We know that they're going to be coming down the pike, and we can actually get together our key partners and players and start talking about what we need to do to be ready for any fallout from that. You'll see also there's some routine pre-planned events like May Day, which we've always got some knuckleheads out there that are going to be doing something bad. Torchlight Parade, the Pride Parade. We actually, for the first time ever in my career, we activated for New Year's Eve. We've got a new administration. We never know what's going to happen with Homeland extremists anymore. We did not have any credible threats, but we did it as an opportunity to actually practice and go through the maneuvers and get our new administration moved in. A couple items sprinkled in there are exercises that we've done, as well as you see a couple lines in blue. We also, and I'll talk a little bit later, we learn a lot from deploying our staff out to other sites. We've had staff that were deployed under the Emergency Management Assistance Compact to help New York City during Hurricane Super Sandy storm. We helped up in Oso. We had over 100 city employees go up and help in a whole cadre of roles, from public information to critical incident stress management to serving in their EOC up there. We've helped with the Eastern Washington fires up there in Okanagan County that got hit really bad. There are jurisdictions in the state of Washington that don't have the plethora of resources that we do for the city of Seattle. We've got 14 staff. And there are emergency managers that they're doing it as a quarter of their time. So we really learn a lot, and we give back to being able to help our partners out there across the state as well as the nation. So talking a little bit about our Emergency Operations Center, and I truly believe you've got to establish a culture. You've got to create a culture that allows people to feel welcome. It allows them to feel like they can contribute. We teach people when we do our EOC training that when you walk through that door, I don't care if you've got bars or badges or whatever, you're an individual, that you've got thoughts and ideas and experiences, and we want you to actively contribute to the discussions, to the problem solving, because who knows what you might have from your background and your experience that could add into being able to solve an issue that we're dealing with. We are all about relationships. We've got to have those relationships before a disaster happens. Scott Hines again hit on this yesterday about the Amtrak incident. It's better for us to know one another, and having known Jay for lots of years. And Jay, even though he's up in Orcas, but if he shows up in my EOC and he walks through the door, I know that I can count on him because I've interacted with him. I've been in planning meetings. I've been in EOC activations with him. I know what he can bring to the table. It's important that we have those relationships ahead of time. We are very proactive on meeting anytime there's a business. Amazon we've met with, Starbucks we've met with. Anytime we have a new director that comes into the city of Seattle, we go and do a 30-minute orientation with them. We meet with our colleagues from the different county emergency management organizations. We have a really tight relationship with King County Emergency Management. It's all about making sure that you have those relationships ahead of time, but it also needs to go beyond that. You need to be rolling up your sleeves and working through those planning issues and ensuring that you can get things down in place ahead of time. Learning from others. So besides us deploying people to other disasters, we also invite speakers from other disasters. So we invited Mayor Bob Parker from Christchurch. He was very entertaining. He's quite the funny guy. I don't know if you were there, but he's incredible. But it was helpful to hear, especially from an elected, what was his perspective for that earthquake for them? How was their response, and what are the recovery issues that they're dealing with? We also just recently had another individual come in from Christchurch. We do everything we can to learn from other people's disasters. We don't wish those on anybody for those disasters, but by gosh, if there's a way that we can learn from those and be able to peel back the layers of the onion and get more into that novelty that we may be able to forecast or not, we appreciate those opportunities. We are all about, Barb terms it concierge service. And I think it is a beneficial piece of what we do in our office and in the EOC. As I mentioned, there's 14 of us in the Office of Emergency Management, and we are all about welcoming you in and introducing ourselves and getting to know who you are and making sure that we're providing whatever you need there. It's part of just that, you know how you feel when you go to a concierge at a hotel? They're there to help you. Some of them might be too busy sometimes, but most of the time they're there to help you. They're there to help guide you, to give you insights on places you might want to visit. We're there to help you. We're trying to create that environment and that culture of being able to make people comfortable. In emergency management, we also, when we hire people, we're not only hiring for their experience, and sometimes they don't need to have lots of experience in emergency management, but we're also looking for those soft skills. And the soft skills are, how can they facilitate? Can they step in and lead? Do they stay cool under a stressful situation? Are they people? Are they kind of oriented to people? Can they relate to people easily? Those are the types of things that we look at beyond just the typical emergency management skills. We practice. As I mentioned, New Year's Eve, even though there were no threats, it was our opportunity to get into the EOC and just practice. And especially since we had a new administration, that we could get them oriented into how we function. Rather do that now than when something bad happens and we're all in that stressful environment. And we also lean forward in a very proactive measure. Again, we may not need to activate, we activated for actually the Women's March. So last year the Women's March was a far larger crowd. This year we didn't have as big of a crowd. Again, we had no threats, but again, it was our opportunity to get in and lean in and be ready if for any reason transportation impacts occur, or we've got to do some peripheral impacts to something that happens, somebody drives into a crowd by mistake or not, we're ready to do that. So we're all about breaking down silos. Emergency management for the city of Seattle, and hopefully all emergency managements across the nation, it's an emergency management with a big P. And I use this term from the Emergency Management Accreditation Program. There's EMAP is how you can go through the processes to get your program accredited. Emergency management is all city departments. It's all of our agencies and organizations that make up what we do. It's not just our little 14 people. It's the entire city that makes up our emergency management program. And we need to break down those silos. And Jay can attest to this. We have a group called the Strategic Work Group. They meet on a monthly basis, and they get together. Barb calls it the orange concentrate of our larger disaster management committee. But we're the ones, again, that we get in that room, we roll up our sleeves, and we start talking about our plans. We talk about preparing for May Day. We train with one another, we exercise with one another. So we try to get those partners into the room at the same time. So we're always trying to break down those silos. There's great people, like PIOs are a great example. They excel really well on a day-to-day basis. Then you open up the Joint Information Center, which is where you bring all your PIOs and you have one voice for the city. Sometimes it's a little hard because they're used to doing their kind of one-on-one thing with the media. They're great, talented people. We just get them in and be more strategic rather than just being individual departments represented in the JIC. Our EOC, and any of you are more than welcome to come down and see our Emergency Operations Center. I've gone through 3 EOC designs. King County was one, Bellevue was the other one, and then this one. Mayor Nichols went to Kobe. He was very inspired by what Kobe had done for preparedness and came back and we were able to get a fire levee. The fire levee built our facility. It's co-located with Fire Station 10, as well as it did seismic retrofit for all the fire stations in the city of Seattle. We've got a large local operations room. So we've got large screens towards the front that allows us to provide situational awareness, that common operating picture. We also have monitors on the side so we can display maps. We've displayed up particular mission areas and what is the progress that we're making on those missions. We have sections. You probably have seen some EOCs where it looks like NASA, that they're kind of in an auditorium. It's not necessarily the flavor that we're used to. It may work for them, but we really like what we call these kind of pods, where you get around a table all the health and human services folks. You get around the table all the infrastructure folks, be it transportation, Puget Sound Energy, Army Corps of Engineers, City Light, Public Utilities, etc. So it really is an environment that is conducive to face-to-face coordination. And that's the other thing that we tell when we train people in the EOC. You've got to get up and talk to one another. That's the benefit of opening up a room like that and giving everybody in the same space. Plus you can also hear things, so you may be seated over at the fire table, as we've got Chris here, and you may hear something that Health and Human Services is dealing with. You can get up over there and say, hey, you know, I got some ideas for you. It's really a conducive environment for being able to interact with one another. This picture down here is our Joint Information Center. So you see a gaggle of PIOs there. They've got a space where they can do their production of anything that relates to pushing messages out to the public. This particular picture here is actually from our homelessness activation. We were activated for 37 weeks for the homelessness response, and it really geared up the citywide approach to how we deal with homelessness here in the city of Seattle. This is from Cascadia, so Hans, I did find some pictures of you in our inventory. Our room, the beauty of it is we can easily put in 150 people, and you don't feel like you've got to yell to talk with someone. You can really have some great conversations. Cascadia was a really good exercise for us to work through all the nuts and bolts of how we do that organization and agency collaboration. We did have a National Guard rep in there. He was incredible. I gotta tell you, and one of the lessons learned for us is we always need to have a National Guard rep in our EOC, let alone the county EOC needs to have that. He really provided insight to the resources and the capabilities that the National Guard has. And I'll talk a little bit here about situational awareness. So this is kind of a larger schematic of the Emergency Operations Center. So we have our police table, fire table, this is our logistics folks, planning table, Health and Human Services infrastructure. Our EOC director kind of is in the middle, and then you see all these breakout rooms. So the mayor and policy, Joint Information Center, we can do media conferences, news conferences, we've got planning rooms, communications, and then we've got breakout rooms around the side. We don't necessarily designate specific spots for people. Again, whatever the situation necessitates, we will get people to the table. So there are a couple spots that have particular radios, but we try to mix around whatever we need to do to match people up. I want to talk a little bit about our planning section. I tend to think of our planning section as kind of the heart of the EOC, because we have to gather information, we have to make sense of that information, we have to have someone sitting aside not thinking about the current and thinking about long-term, and we also have to have an action plan. What is going to be that roadmap that guides what we need to do to accomplish in the EOC? So one of those things is, how many of you have been taking your ICS classes? Yay! Did you hear about an incident action plan in your training? Probably so. So we've taken just a little bit of a spin. We actually call it our Consolidated Action Plan, because it's not so much about the tactics, which again happens out in the field. We're about being strategic and doing coordination. We do not do command and control out of our EOC, and there are some EOCs that do that. We do not do that in the city of Seattle. We've got great capability out in the operational departments. Then we get those operational reps in the EOC so that we can look at the larger strategic perspective and getting people to connect up with one another to support field operations and to support our community. So we create those consolidated action plans. Example is pre-planned. So for the Women's March last Saturday, we had a consolidated action plan in place. It talks about what is the overall situation. Here are our 4 operational objectives we're going to focus on for this operational period. Here's who the staffing positions are, who's going to fill operations, who's going to fill Joint Information Center, Health and Human Services, Planning Section, etc. And then it gets down into, here's what our here's objective 1. Here's all the tasks that we need to accomplish, and here's who's responsible for those. So it's like a sheet of music. It's guiding us so that we can all stay in tune with one another and be marching forward in the same direction on what we're facing for the particular incident. So as I said, pre-planned events are really sweet because we can do that ahead of time. When it's spontaneous, we actually have these standing operational objectives. So back in September of 2015, we had our monthly disaster management committee meeting. We were just on the heels of saying goodbye to the Chinese president, and at 11-something, we saw the public information officer peel out of the EOC really quick, and we're like, something's not right. And one of our representatives looked at their cell phone, and lo and behold, we had the incident on the Aurora Bridge, where we had the charter bus for the Seattle Community College students, as well as the duck. They had an accident, and subsequently we ended up losing 5 individuals. But we spontaneously started with these objectives. They're very high level, but at least start getting us focused. They're always at the front end, or front of the EOC, so we can just start going from there. So here's an example of some objectives and some operational periods that I pulled out of our Consolidated Action Plan. So for the Cascadia Exercise, you'll see up at the top, those were our initial objectives in the first day of operations for that exercise. So we were really focusing on providing support to firefighting, anything that needed to relate to rescuing, trying to start gathering that assessment of what's going on in the community. And then we realized we do need to start thinking about how do we shelter people, because we're looking at a long-term impact to people not being able to get back into their homes. And then you'll see that we became even more focused later in the next, it looks like in the next day, where we tightened those up. And so we had a target there, for instance, on number 3, creating a shelter capacity for 31,000 people and 10,000 pets. Wow, you think we do that on a day-to-day basis? We don't. But we've got plans in place. And it requires that cross-coordination with our partners in King County, because we can't do it alone. And we're going to have to tap into the feds to be able to get resources that they have. Here's an example from the Aurora bus duck incident back in 2015. So as I mentioned, we start with those very high-level objectives. And then as we work through the day and into the next day, we got more clarity on what we needed to focus on. Again, this is what's going to guide all of us collectively in the EOC. And again, we're supporting what's happening out in the field, and we're supporting what's going on in our community to make sure that we can get people up and going as quickly as possible. Situational awareness. So much information comes in. And it's, we were talking as we were walking over, we can get deluged. So think about those incidents that we talked about earlier that really seared on your mind. What might be some of the informational pieces that we need to be aware of? So OSO, what do you think is the information that we're going to need in an emergency operations center?
Well, I remember the number of casualties being a piece of information that evolved, and it seemed like the most important part, and we or whoever was putting the information out had it wrong. But it kept, with every iteration it got closer and closer.
Yeah.
So the number of casualties, the immediate threat, like flooding, we hadn't thought of.
Yes.
But that was luckily what people were working on in the dark.
Yeah. Where does information come from?
We got it from everywhere, citizens on cell phones and soldiers that just walked in.
Yeah. I would assume that a weather forecast is going to be critical for those operations up there. A lot of private resources responded, knowing who's on scene. Fire does a great job of doing their passport system. I don't know if they still, if that's the term that they use, but accountability for people. News media. City of Seattle doesn't have a helicopter. King County Sheriff's Office is what we use for our helo capabilities, but When I was at King County, we used one of the news companies to fly up and do a quick shot for us so that we at least had some understanding. There was some landslide on Cedar River. That was back in, I think, 2003 or 4. So all this information is coming from all different sources. We have information from reps that are getting it from the field. They're either calling it in or they're radioing it in or they're sending emails. We're getting it from citizens, as you mentioned, or community members feeding in. We have amateur radio operators that can be eyes and ears out there. We're watching social media. We're watching the media actively. It comes in from all different sources, and it sometimes just feels like a deluge. So how do we take all those pieces to start shaping what is the actual picture? What are we facing? So we've got to figure out how to do that. And that's where our planning section is responsible for taking all that divergent information and trying to start piecing it together so it gives us clarity or some clarity on what we're facing so that we can start making decisions and start deploying resources. It gives us a better understanding of what we've got to deal with. So there's a set of questions, again, that we have posted up at the front of our EOC. That's a primer. I mean, think about it. If you responded to the EOC at 2 a.m., do you remember all the questions you need to answer? All right, and some of this is common sense, but we've got this list of questions. What is the situation? What are the impacts? What are we doing about it? What are your unmet needs and the urgency of those needs? Are you mobilizing beyond current on-duty personnel? If yes, why? Are you able to maintain normal service delivery? If not, what has changed? And what information needs to be shared with the public? They're very simple, but again, when they're up there in the front of the EOC, it gets you. You got to prime the pump for people. They're really smart people, but we've got to just keep things and tools in front of us so that it helps prime the pump for what we need to do. So part of that priming the pump, I don't know if there was any in any of the ICS classes. Essential elements of information. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
It is mentioned once, but...
Yeah. So again, it's part of that priming the pump. So we have a spreadsheet that we've created that on one side maybe fire needs to check in with the fire alarm center to see what the call volume is on the types of calls that they're dealing with. What's West Precinct from the police communications? What are their call volumes? What do we know from the fiber service from the IT department? What do we know for the cell service providers? Where are they at in their services that they provide? It's priming the pump for what are those types of questions or tidbits of information that we need to deal with so we can start piecing together the puzzle and starting to get an understanding of what's going on. We do, Hans was privy to an opportunity to be in the EOC for Cascadia and interface with an electronic system that we use called WebEOC. There's a whole plethora of systems out there. It's been a system that we've stayed with for quite a length of time, and we've adapted it to what our needs are. It is truly a documentation tool. It isn't Ike over at SDOT putting something in there, hoping that Chris over at the fire table is going to see it. They got to get up and talk to one another. And then they use that as a way to document their conversation or any actions that they might have taken. We make it available to our council members. We make it available to our mayor's office. We make it available to lots of people. We're all about sharing information. The more we share, the more you're informed on what you need to do back in your own operations, be it if you're a private entity or a public entity. We do snapshot reports. Snapshot reports are truly just that one segment in time. So we have on the Women's March, we did a snapshot at the bottom of every hour. So starting at, it was like 10:30 that morning, we did our first snapshot report. And it was everything that happened from 9:30 to 10:30. And just put down that. Then at 11:30, we do another snapshot report. We don't repeat anything. It's everything new from 10:30 to 11:30. So it's a quick, here's what's going on. And people love it because they're getting that instant information directly from us in the Emergency Operations Center. And then traditional situation reports. Those are the roll-up. After a 12-hour operational period or a 6-hour, depending on what the incident is, it's a roll-up of everything. We used to do stand-up briefings. We get everybody up and in the center of the room and we do a kind of quick check-in. What's going on? And have an awareness across the room. It usually takes anywhere from 5-10 minutes at the most, but they're just quick check-ins. Here's what's going on, here's what we know. Gets an opportunity for everybody to hear all at the same time of what's going on with one another. Damage assessment collection, we have lots of work to do in this yet. And Hans was directly involved in this particular function for Cascadia, and we tested out some very straw man kind of protocols for that. We have lots of work. This is a huge work pill. And if you think about Cascadia, you think about the thousands and thousands of buildings that need to be inspected structurally. Darn, we just had an aftershock. Now we got to do another inspection. Thousands of people that are going to be sheltered. All the community businesses, or community private businesses that are impacted. And being able to open up the spigot for public assistance and individual assistance. We've seen this with the hurricanes the last year here. And then mapping provides us kind of that visual of what's going on out there. So an example of that is, this is one of the fruits of your work down at the EOC. We tested out creating a damage assessment report, and then we did a very high-level flyover, and this just focuses on structures. So our building department has to go out and inspect. Immediately after a disaster, there will be individuals that are trained to just go out and do kind of looks like a crack there, and we probably need to evacuate out. Two, there are private businesses that hire structural engineers, but ultimately the building official in the local jurisdiction needs to sign off on those. So they've got their tagging system of green, yellow, and red. But again, think of all the thousands of buildings in the city of Seattle. The other function in our planning section is someone needs to get outside of the here and now and look forward. Subsequently, the horse up there with the blinders. What are we missing? We're looking at, in another 24 hours, we've got a rainstorm coming in and the temperature's going to drop significantly. And we're still doing rescues out there. We've got people that are setting up tents and trying to shelter. We had an incident in, I don't remember what year that was. The University Bridge, there was a public utilities pipeline that ruptured. It ate away the footing of the University Bridge. In that spot that got eroded out, there were 2 cars. The 2 cars fell into that eroded sinkhole that then rested on a gas line. Gas line hadn't ruptured yet. Underneath the gas line, lo and behold, we had somebody thinking, okay, what if the gas line ruptures? Well, lo and behold, we found out there's a fiber line that connects North Seattle to South Seattle underneath that. What happens if we sever that? We've lost all connectivity on the north and the south side. Someone had to be thinking outside of what we're all busy dealing with now and responding to. What are those long-term things? How do we forecast? And we've had fairly good success with this. We've done this with pre-planned events. What if we have an IED? What if we have someone drive into a crowd? What if? And we've got to spend more time doing those what if scenarios, because that gets us thinking about what we need to deal with.
Everybody knows what an IED is?
Improvised explosive device, yes. AERs, how many of you have seen an after-action report? So it's a summary of how the response went. We always do a survey right after we close up the EOC, we do a survey, get their feedback. Did we accomplish the 4 objectives? Did we meet our objectives? What went well, what didn't go well? Out of all those, then we have an improvement plan. What have we got to fix before the next disaster? And some things are low-hanging fruit and other things are bigger chunks of work that we need to tackle. So here's a smattering of different incidents that we've had that we've opened up the EOC and we've done after-action reports. Those are all posted on our webpage if you so wish to look at. Some of them are long and some of them are really short and sweet. So crisis, how many of you have read this book, Managing Crisis? I highly recommend it. I had the opportunity to go back to Harvard, their Kennedy School for Executives. And Art and Dutch back there do an awesome job of, it's a week-long course, it's called Leadership in Crisis. and you get to interact with your colleagues. We had colleagues from international, and it was incredible. They basically walk you through case studies. So we went through the space shuttle incident, the coal mine collapse down in Chile. We went through World Trade incident in New York City. There was about a dozen or so incidents that we just started dissecting. In this book, they actually have a number of those case studies in here. And it's really insightful on, as you start peeling back the layers of how do we transition from going from routine, known stuff to crises that are very novel and we've never faced ever before. How do we try to figure out how to balance responding to those? So there's a lot of factors that make up a crisis. We don't know what we don't know. We always talk about periscope up. Always keep thinking about what's there that we don't necessarily have an awareness on. Removing hierarchies. They talk in this book in Crisis that sometimes you may have to go to a flat hierarchy, and then once you start implementing a particular mission, you may get back to that hierarchy. But those hierarchies don't necessarily work during crises. It may become a flat type of organization. And we've got to realize we can't just think about the routine. We've got to take those blinders off and periscope up and think about what else is not there that we're seeing that could be there. An example, very simple example of that is when the Northridge earthquake happened,